Hello, people of the internet, and welcome to the second installment in our look at the history of Godzilla in animation. I am your host, Andres Perez, aka Kaiju Noir, and here with me, of course, is my co-host for this little mini-series of videos, Mr. Matthew Denian.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back here again and to continue moving through Godzilla in animation.
And so, what are we going to be looking at this time, Mr. Denian?
Today, we'll be looking at the 1978 series Godzilla, done by Hanna-Barbera.
Yes.
The same studio that brought us Scooby-Doo and other classics.
Absolutely. Now, Hanna-Barbera was a company that I grew up with. I was very familiar with back in the 90s because being a child of the 90s, I was one of those first generation of people that grew up with Cartoon Network. And during the early days, before they started creating original series, they had a huge back catalog of Warner Brothers and Hanna-Barbera shorts, and so among all those Hanna-Barbera shorts, be it like the Flintstones, the Jetsons, Johnny Quest,
yes,
I'm sure there's of course Scooby-Doo. Among all of those, I quickly got into Godzilla during this era, especially when this was right around the time where I first saw Jurassic Park as a kid, and then I quickly got into dinosaurs, and from there I went into Godzilla, and so this was kind of like I saw the Hanna-Barbera Godzilla series at the right time. I was at the right age at the right time to catch it on television. So what was your first exposure to this series?
I'm a little bit older than you. I actually didn't come across it, I want to say, until the late 80s because it was kind of out of syndication. I watched a lot of Hanna-Barbera as a kid, like on USA Network and stuff, like you said, with Johnny Quest. And we get the Herculoids was pretty cool and stuff like that. But yeah, but they didn't show too much Godzilla. So I think when maybe Godzilla 1985 came out here in the U.S., they did a very limited VHS release of this series at the same time. So I think I picked it up around then, I'm going to say.
Okay, and so before we revisited this series, what would you say were some of the episodes that stuck out to you the most, or the ones that that stayed in your head throughout all these years?
Definitely the pilot episode, the Firebird, because it had a very Rodan type monster, stuck out pretty good for me. There was also, I felt like the Colossus of Atlantis episode stuck out because the monster was kind of unique in that, where it's kind of like a floating pyramid robot.
Right. I would definitely like to get into that particular episode and later on in this video.
Sure.
For me, sorry, go ahead. Not sure if you were finished or not.
No, I think that was it. I want to say the other one that stuck out for me is the Marco episode, where it's like a giant sea turtle, just because kind of Gamera-ish.
Oh, yeah. That was the one with the magnetic powers, right, in the South or North Pole?
Yes.
Yeah. I did have that same thought, where this is the closest we can get to Gamera versus Godzilla.
Aside from reading Atomic Rex.
Oh, yeah, of course. But I mean, in an official capacity.
Yes.
Let's see. I'm not sure if Godzilla actually ever fought a turtle in the TriStar animated series, but we'll get to that eventually.
Yes.
Let's see. For me, one of the episodes that always stuck with me, I don't know why, but it was the Island of Lost Ships. This was the one where the Calico gets stranded on a ship where they meet the evil sirens, and the evil sirens are in control of both the Minotaur and the Chimera. And I think this might have been my first exposure to the Chimera, so I always thought it was a very bizarre mishmash of different animals, which was what the Chimera actually was in the actual stories that it was based off of. And it was always stuck out to me because I rarely do I see very villains, especially ones that die at the hands of Godzilla. So it felt very strange and bizarre compared to everything else, where it's just Godzilla versus a giant animal that he eventually pummels to death. And instead it's here he is taking on some female villains, which was something I didn't really see a whole lot of within these older cartoons. So let's see, any other ones? I do remember it was thing was called the Macro Monsters, and that was the one where Godzilla was fighting like gigantic versions of bigger animals. And I remember seeing a giant flying stingray, and I don't know why, but that giant flying stingray always stuck out to me, because maybe it was because as a kid I was like, hey, that thing can't fly in real life. And I remember being fascinated with stingrays, because I thought they looked cool because of that particular episode. Any other episodes that I remembered seeing?
One that stuck out for me, especially growing up in the 80s, is episode 25. They had a terrorist group named Cobra, not to be confused with the Cobra from G.I. Joe.
Yeah.
But I still thought that was kind of cool, because when I was a kid, I was like, oh, this is Cobra. This means that Godzilla and G.I. Joe take place in the same universe. But not so.
It's also funny because I forgot what was the name of the studio that created Transformers and G.I. Joe, but I remember there was this one individual who, I think his name was Buzz Dixon. He worked in a lot of animation during the 70s and 80s, and he mentioned how they would get away. He mentioned on a podcast interview, he mentioned how they would get away with getting certain names and characters from one TV show and bring them over into another TV show from the same studio, without the studios noticing too much. So they're like they're recycling assets, but at the same time, while inadvertently creating a shared universe.
Yeah, and in particular, the Hector Ramirez reporter is in.
That's exactly what he was talking about.
Yeah, that character is in G.I. Joe, Transformers, Inhumanoids, and Gem. So they all have a shared universe. I'm a big Gem fan.
That's really nice.
Not really.
That you could say that was truly outrageous to hear. Somebody kill me.
Yeah.
Let's see.
This just goes back to us being the coolest people in our circle, doesn't it? That I knew that information.
That is unfortunate.
Yeah.
Within our circle of friends, that like not just us two, but within our circle of friends among the entire fan base. This is gonna sound conceited as hell, but it feels like we're probably like the coolest people, or like the most normal people when you really see the Godzilla fan base in person. And I'm probably sure I pissed off a whole lot of people right now.
That's okay. I'm sitting in an office with nobody but myself and a giant dollhouse behind me, and that's about as cool as I get. So,
cool guy, Matt Didion.
Yeah. All right, moving on before we lose more listeners.
Let's see. Oh yeah, the last one I remember was the Breeder Beast, because when I first saw that episode, I remember it being really weird for Godzilla to fight a giant jelly monster, and then years down the line, I would actually watch Godzilla vs. Hedorah, and I thought, oh, okay, so was the Breeder Beast somehow inspired by Hedorah? It was just a creature that, like a slug-like, slimy creature that would grow larger and larger over time. And,
right.
Yeah, so it's like what the experience you had with the Firebird, I had with the Breeder Beast.
And another one that kind of stuck out for me a little bit is the seaweed monster one, because it was kind of like a man thing, swamp thing type monster, which I thought was kind of cool to be fighting Godzilla.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's definitely the case. And all right, then. So, going into the basic premise of this story, you can clearly tell this was a reflection of the public perception of Godzilla at the time, where this is 1978, the Showa series ended a couple years prior with the Terror of Mechagodzilla. And so Hanna-Barbera came in, they got permission to do this series until their contract eventually expired. So they made a series where that featured a superhero-ish Godzilla portrayed in a style that my friend Zazubar has referred to as big gun syndrome, where within the later Showa era of Godzilla films, they would treat Godzilla like a weapon to bring out at the end of the movie in order to clean up the mess made by the villains. Whether it be Ghidorah, Gigan, Mechagodzilla, or Megalon, they come out, they do their thing, and then Godzilla comes in at the very end to clean up their mess.
Right, yes. Sort of like the Megazord, I would think, from Power Rangers, right? In that type of vein?
Absolutely, yeah. And so it's like a big like the Megazord is literally a big weapon that you bring out to finish off the villain. And that's what Godzilla was, how he was treated it as within these movies, and that's kind of how he's treated here, like a big gun. And So why exactly is he being treated as a weapon here? Well, the premise of this story is that you have a team of scientific researchers. Two are really researchers. One is an assistant, and the other is a child that one of the scientists brought on with them. We have Captain Carl Majors. He is the leader of this crew aboard the Calico. We have his partner, who is what's her name? Quinn.
Quinn.
Yes, we have, let's see, I have their last names
here.
Darien, yes, thank you. Quinn Darien. They have their research assistant, Brock. We have Quinn's nephew, Pete Darien, and alongside these four individuals is a giant, goofy-looking monster by the name of Godzuki, who happens to be the cowardly nephew of Godzilla. And one of the biggest detriments to the series is that we never see how the crew of the Calico and how they ended up meeting Godzuki and Godzilla and how they formed this relationship. Once we get into the first episode featuring the Firebird, we already have the status quo set up right away. So this is back in the day where they wanted all these episodes to remain standalone, zero continuity with each other. You can showcase these episodes in any order you so wish, and you will not miss a beat outside of not knowing how they got to this status quo. Apparently, there was a series Bible for this show, and within that series Bible, it mentioned that the Calico crew at one point rescued Godzuki, who was stuck in he was stuck in some sort of life-threatening situation, and to show his gratitude, Godzilla agreed to help out the Calico crew whenever possible. And
I say the captain has a beacon that he can hit that calls Godzilla, but with no kind of explanation about how that works, if it's his pager for Godzilla or if they have Wi-Fi on the ship. I don't know, but it can
I always thought
contact
it was
Godzilla.
I always thought it was like some sort of sonar technology.
That's what I took it as. Or Godzuki could call Godzilla as well in situations where it didn't work. So
Yeah. So they always had a backup plan in order to summon Godzilla. Although I think some of the best episodes, in my opinion, are the ones in which Carl Majors and his Godzilla signal, both him and the signal and Godzuki were all how would you say, disabled to some degree, and that would put a lot more drama on and more build more tension for the human characters. And especially there are some episodes where the characters are stuck in a foreign environment. They have no way of contacting Godzilla, or there are episodes in where Godzilla cannot solve the problem and he needs to be rescued by the human characters. I believe those are actually some of the best episodes because they kind of subvert the audience's expectations. However, I feel like these episodes are few and far between because a lot of these episodes follow a particular formula. And within this formula, we have the opening, which involves Godzuki getting into some wacky, slapsticky hijinks. Then we come across some big disaster. They call on Godzilla once. Godzilla solves the problem and goes away. Then they come across the real villains of the episode. They call upon Godzilla a second time. He comes in, solves the problem, and then we bookend the episode with more slapstick from Godzuki.
Right, and there's not really much explanation about what kind of scientists they are or why they continue to find giant monsters.
Yeah, it's like every episode they're a different. They act like a different kind of scientists. Like one day they're oceanographers because they're studying sea life. Another episode they're archaeologists because they're studying some ancient pyramid. Another day they're chemists because they're able to discern what the monster is made out of. Another episode they're botanists because they're studying plants. Another episode they're astronomists because they happen to know something about constellations. It's like these stretched out the term. This is like back in the day where if you're a scientist, it means like you have this knowledge on anything and everything related to science.
Right, they are true Renaissance scientists. These people, they have their toes in everything, so to speak.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure like Carl Majors and Quinn Darien, they both probably have like 10, 20 doctorates in every single field ever.
Right, right.
Yeah, I could tell, like, perhaps like Quinn, she never had children of her own, so that's why she decided to take Pete under her wing. Although that's a funny thing. It's like, we know virtually nothing about these characters.
No, they have zero backstory. Like you said, we're just really plopped into. They're on a boat. They're scientists. In the first episode, they respond to a distress call, and that's all we're given. We don't know why Pete is there with his aunt, why Pete's parents let him go on a boat where they constantly run into monsters, have a giant monster on board, and have another one following him around all the time. There's no explanation.
We don't know if like Brock is like a legitimate like university student. Is he getting like college credit for working on this? Is this an internship? Like what exactly is he working towards? The only real people, like even within Carl and Quinn, we don't really know their like relationship or how long they've been partners. They like, I noticed that, interesting enough, Quinn is the only character who refers to Captain Majors by his first name. So I guess they can have somewhat of a closer relationship, but obviously there's nothing romantic here because, again, we know nothing about them nor the relationship to each other. If anything, I would say that Brock is kind of the most interesting in that he is both he acts like both a kid and an adult depending on who he's with, because whenever he hangs out with Carl and Quinn, he acts very professional, yet whenever he's around Pete, he's willing to get involved in the fun.
Right, he's kind of like the bridge between the two of them, the two groups, if you will, the kid and Godzuki forming one group, and then Carl and Quinn forming the secondary group, and Brock is sort of the go-between between them.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we have Godzuki, which I believe was like probably had more focus on than any other character in the show. And with Godzuki, I got a very strong Scooby-Doo vibe from him, where it's like they wanted to have a character that embodied both Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo, because I guess during this time it was very popular to give a nephew to any popular character, because it was like giving them a son without the burden of them actually being a father. Be it like Godzuki or Scrappy-Doo or Huey, Dewey, and Louie for Donald in Donald Duck's case.
Right. In particular, in the Hanna-Barbera series, that kind of goofy sidekick, if you will, popped up a lot. Like you'd have Blip from Space Ghost, for instance. A very good example would be the series that I think they pretty much borrowed directly from for Godzilla is the Moby Dick series that Hanna-Barbera did, where, I don't know if you've seen that or not, but the formula would be that there's these two scuba kids who can swim the entire ocean. They have a seal with them called Scooby, ironically enough, with a nod to Scooby-Doo.
Yeah. And this was Hanna-Barbera?
Yeah, Hanna-Barbera. It was part of Moby Dick and the Mighty Mightor. And Moby Dick's with them, and they would inevitably run into some problem where they'd have to call Moby Dick to quickly solve it. There'd be some monster that showed up later, and at the end they'd call Moby Dick to be the big gun, as you mentioned, come in and clean it up again. But if you're to look at the formula for both series, and that series took place like in the 60s, it's about 10 years before the Godzilla animated series, it's pretty much the same thing, where you've got these a kid who's got like a goofy kind of bridge between themselves and the monster, if you will, if Moby Dick's filling that monster role, and then they come in to clean up whatever problem they run into at the end. It's almost the exact same formula.
Wow. And you know what? I know that in the past, Hanna-Barbera they were not above copying their, ripping off themselves. They've made a lot of clones of Scooby-Doo back in the past. Like, do you remember, what was it? Dune Buggy.
Yes, Dune Buggy or Jabberjaws.
Jabberjaw, with the shark that acted like Curly from the Three Stooges. And I remember they had Dune Buggy, like, he's gonna burn rubber. I bet you no Millennium here alive knows who Jabberjaw and Dune Buggy are. Or how about the Funky Phantom, who kind of talks like the Pink Panther?
Yeah, he would kind of pop up later on the Mike Tyson Mysteries, right? As the Marquise de Queenberry.
Yeah. Or wasn't there Captain Caveman? Remember him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And another example of them copying themselves is Space Ghost was one of their bigger hits, and then Birdman would follow shortly after, like the exact same power set and,
and they got
setup and stories.
It's even the same voice actor who's shouting his name, like Space Ghost Birdman.
But to be fair, as we're pointing out the flaws to these shows, it's clearly directed at a younger audience. So that kind of like formulaic approach to it probably set well, for us when we were kids, and like my kids will watch this now too, and they kind of like this series because they know where it's going. So it's not like a lot of twists and turns, and it's very easy for them to access.
Yeah, I think like of all the before we move on, I think of all the rip-offs of the of like all the cases of Hanna-Barbera ripping themselves off. I think probably the most egregious one, I forgot the name, but it was this show that featured a bunch of kids who solve mysteries with a talking dog, except the dog is green this time, and he can turn invisible for some reason, and that was his shtick.
That one's not ringing a bell, but I would believe that it existed because it's Hanna-Barbera, so it's what they do.
Yeah, and like there's a green dog that had like a beanie. I really wish I knew what this show was, but I remember it was like it's literally they didn't even bother changing the species like with Jabberjaw. It was just literally just Scooby-Doo, except Scooby can turn invisible. So yeah.
But for this series, absolutely, if any of the fans can track it down, watch an episode of Hanna-Barbera's Moby Dick and then watch an episode of Godzilla. It's almost the same episode. I guarantee it.
And I was going to give Godzilla credit for at least trying to combine the more action-oriented shows like the Herculoids or Space Ghost, along with their group of mystery-solving individuals with their goofy, anthropomorphic animal friend. But as you mentioned before, it looks like they already ripped themselves off. They already did that previously with Moby Dick. But that's not the only thing that they've recycled. If you're someone who has watched at least even more than one episode, you'll notice that they recycle a lot of animation from episode to episode, and that's kind of what made Hanna-Barbera as successful as it was, because I think before Hanna-Barbera, many animation studios were struggling to produce animation for television, and because they were dealing with a much more limited budget, they have less resources, and so a lot of the early attempts at animation for television weren't so successful. But Hanna-Barbera was able to be as profitable as it was because they were able to reuse as many assets as possible as often as they could in order to put out a more complete product that was at, I guess, a higher quality than anyone else at the time. And so they were able they knew how to cut corners the smart way. And as a result, we have a lot of the similar animation cycles for Godzilla and the rest of the crew, be it them like the walking cycles, especially for Godzilla's. It's weird, like of all the animation, probably the most common you will see is of Godzilla walking, and it's probably the weirdest one because even though Godzilla, unlike with all these characters, their animation model tends to shift depending on what scene they're in, but the proportions on Godzilla always looked weird in that model, where in that walking cycle, where it looked like his head was probably farther away from the camera, and that's why the top part of his body looks more smaller than the lower portion.
Yeah, Hanna-Barbera is notorious for that. If you watch the series, you'll see something that pops up a lot in Hanna-Barbera where they're just missing pieces of characters. Like a lot of times for no reason, if you look quickly, Carl has no beard in a lot of group shots because they forget to animate it.
Mm-hmm. In one shot, I saw they accidentally turned Brock white.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they'll do stuff like that all the time. In fact, if you watch their Super Friends episodes, there's notorious scenes where like Batman has no pants on and stuff like that. If you're just...
Or whatever reason, like
very quickly.
whatever reason his neck is exposed, or in like a close up of if he's holding something, they do a close up of his hands and he's not wearing any gloves. They probably forgot. They thought that maybe the animators thought it was Superman who was holding on to that envelope.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Two unique things I want to point out about the series, Andres. One would be the addition of a new power for Godzilla in the series, Superman-like heat vision that he inexplicably has.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one, and I had to watch the series to pick up on this because this is between Showa and Heisei Godzilla. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is the series that establishes that weird power of Godzilla to inexplicably be standing in water that he was fully submerged in previously.
Oh, yeah, yeah. It's always been one of those weird things that I think a lot of people tend to not really look at unless they really think about it, where
Right.
a monster would rise up out of the ocean, and then somehow, even though the ocean is like hundreds of thousands of meters deep, or miles and miles deep, for whatever reason it looks like the monster is standing on the ocean at like knee level. You can even see it in something as recent as Pacific Rim, where you can clearly see Gypsy Danger rising out of the ocean, and then somehow it looks like he and Knifehead are fighting in a kiddie pool with the water
Right.
only going up to their knees, and then they're able to sink back into the water whenever possible, whenever it's convenient.
Right, right. I don't recall that happening a whole lot in the Showa series.
Right,
But
probably because it'd be a bit more difficult to pull off in the 60s. And let's see, during the set, oh yeah, I guess the only time I can think about that is Godzilla versus the Sea Monster, but that was near an island, so they have an excuse to be able to sit on to look like they're standing on solid ground.
Right. In this series, though, this animated Hanna-Barbera series, the Calico, the boat that they're on, will be in trouble. They'll call Godzilla. He will be completely underwater and then pop up to where it's only ankle deep for him to lift up the boat.
Right. And
So,
speaking of size, this is also a Godzilla who has the ability to change size at will, similar to Ant-Man or Giant Man.
yes, you see that a lot based on the Calico. Sometimes the Calico is like big enough where it's the size of his arm, and sometimes it's like the size of his nostril or something. Like it does seem to change quite a bit.
Like at one point he can hold the boat in his hand. Sometimes he can hold only 5 people in his hand. Sometimes
Right.
he can only hold 1 person in his hand. It's never consistent. And
Godzilla does seem to understand English to some extent in this film in this series as well, because they'll constantly talk to him. They will sort of use Godzuki as like an interpreter sometimes, but sometimes they will talk directly to Godzilla.
Right, and Godzilla is able to understand like the gist of what they say, and he is definitely, you can definitely tell he's on friendly terms with them, especially in early episodes where you can see that he is even smiling on some occasion.
Yes, yeah. And
You mentioned, sorry, before we move on, you did mention before about the laser vision that he has, and what's really funny is that when I saw this show as a kid, I never really had a reaction to the laser vision. I just thought, okay, that's just a thing he does now. But being the Godzilla fan that I am now, and having seen all of this Godzilla media throughout the years, going back and seeing that, even though I know he can do that, it always comes off as a surprise whenever I see him with laser vision. Like, my first reaction is always like, oh yeah, he can do that.
yeah, it's I was comparing it to Shin Godzilla, where he has all these new powers all of a sudden, which previous Godzillas hadn't. With the laser visions kind of coming out of nowhere, where Shin Godzilla can shoot lasers out of his spines and stuff. It works because it's its own Godzilla. It's separate from previous incarnations, but it's still a little weird when you see it, even if you've seen it many times.
Right. And so there was another thing you want to bring up, right?
Yeah, I was going to say one thing about the series, even though it's geared towards kids, that I find slightly disappointing is I feel like the monster fights aren't really all that great throughout the majority of the series. A lot of times they consist of Godzilla and another monster kind of roaring at each other. They might briefly grapple and Godzilla pushes them down, but there's not a whole lot of well choreographed fights. What did you find?
I thought that the fights were probably where a lot of the animation went into. Alongside the slapsticky stretch and squash shenanigans of Godzuki. I feel like the fights were were animated well enough and were given a more of an animalistic vibe to them as they're squirming and squiggling and grappling each other. I was disappointed with how a lot of these monsters are often dealt with, because rarely do you see Godzilla actually, punish these monsters a whole lot. Rarely does he punch or scratch or bite them. Rather, he just kind of grapples with them, wrestle them a bit, and then kind of pins them or throws them into submission until they eventually faint. Or in the case if it's like a non-human, more chemical-based monster, then they're able to be destroyed if they're made out of a non-inorganic material. Such as the case with the Stone Guardians, the Lion Stone Guardians, where they end up crashing into each other and breaking into pieces, with Godzilla moving out of the way at the last second.
Right, or the seaweed monster, they burn it to nothingness type of thing, yes.
That was a pretty messed up death for the seaweed monster. Dying a slow, painful death. But yeah, I feel like this was probably the 60s. This was like the late 70s, and they probably... this was probably very violent for its age, and I feel like maybe this is a level of violence that we rarely see nowadays, especially with most violent shows, animated shows, being relegated to Netflix or are buried under a ton of comedy. So I feel like this was good enough for its day, but there is a little bit of part of me that feels like I wish they could turn up the violence for this show.
Right. Like, I do think, to compare it to, say, the Herculoids had a little bit better choreographed fights and violence with their giant monsters, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Than Godzilla did.
Mm-hmm. Oh, on an unrelated note, I found out what the name of that green Scooby-Doo knockoff was. It was called Goober and the Ghost Chasers.
I vaguely remember that. Okay, so cool. I did want to point out some highlights to this series, though, if you will. I do kind of feel like that the opening theme song is catchy, especially for kids. Like that.
Oh, yeah, totally. Dirty stories. Yeah.
Exactly. And one thing you and I were talking about beforehand that is kind of cool is, would you like to tell the audience who did the voice of the roars for Godzilla in this series?
Absolutely. So for whatever reason, maybe it was like a copyright issue, maybe it was a budgetary issue, but for whatever reason, they did not get the iconic roar for Godzilla, and instead they gave him, along with the majority of the monsters in the show, a voice actor. And for Godzilla, this particular voice actor was none other than Ted Cassidy, who you may know as told by many other people across the internet. Ted Cassidy, he was known for playing Lurch from the Addams Family, the live-action series in particular. And people also may know him as the voice of the Incredible Hulk within the Bill Bixby, Lou Ferrigno live-action series. And he also did to my surprise actually, before recording this, the opening narration. The one like, David Banner is believed to be dead, and he must let the world know that he is dead until he can find a way to control the raging spirit that dwells within him. And now I can only think of like Godzilla as the now I don't think of the Incredible, half of the screen dissolving into the Incredible Hulk roaring. I can just think of half the screen dissolving into Godzilla going. And by the way, I know a lot of people have issues with Godzilla not having that roar and would perhaps love to see the Japanese dub that does include the roar in that TV show. But for me, I always love the roar. Maybe it's because I grew up with it, but I can never hate Ted Cassidy's performance. I just love how savage and vicious he is. He plays up Godzilla, and in a way, it feels like that's what I always did as a kid. Whenever I'm playing with my Godzilla figures, I would like imitate the Godzilla roar, like.
No, I totally agree. I think it makes it more of its own unique version of Godzilla, and it also makes it more applicable to kids because you can't really do that roar from the movies yourself. But as a kid, you can do that roar. I also wanted to ask you, around the same time that this series was going on, Marvel was running their Godzilla series, and I feel like these two Godzillas have a lot in common visually. If you think of the Marvel Godzilla and the Hanna-Barbera Godzilla, just as a side note.
I can definitely see that. Both of them are green. They're made to be much more wider and pudgy looking. They have more like humanoid muscular structures, more humanoid stances. They have large, wide snouts. They have simplified, I think, yeah, more simplified spines, more so in the case of Hanna-Barbera Godzilla for the sake of, animation.
Right.
And they both breathe actual fire. So
Right.
it is kind of interesting how many similarities they have. But I feel like these may have been a coincidence because if you look at any piece of American Godzilla art back in the day, you'll notice that a lot of people tend to have the same misconceptions about over Godzilla's appearance, where they think he's a big, essentially like when they try to think Godzilla, they go back to the Max Fleischer Arctic beast or Arctic giant. And they
You're gonna
think
get that right eventually.
yeah, they go back to the Arctic giant and immediately think of a humanoid, big green humanoid monster, dinosaur, and that's eventually that's like the first thing they go with. Especially if you look at like any old school VHS of Godzilla back in the day.
Right. They kind of take that what was thought a T-Rex looked like at the time with longer arms, more or less. Correct.
Yeah, longer arms and bigger spines.
Right.
Yeah.
The only other reason.
And of course, there's the fire because, it's kind of difficult because the idea of a blue streak of atomic radiation is quite unique. And so people often forget that and they just think fire because, hey, dragons can breathe fire. So their misconceptions of Godzilla's appearance can come from like a combination of dragons and public perception of dinosaurs at the time.
Right. The only other thing I was wondering about the series is when Marvel did their run again at the same time, they plopped Godzilla smack down into the middle of the Marvel universe. And in this series, they didn't really interact with any of the other Hanna-Barbera characters. Like I feel like a Johnny Quest episode would have been really cool, to squeeze in there.
Or I know my friend Dylan, he made a great image that actually spread out a bit throughout the Hanna-Barbera fan community, where my friend, he was able to he depicted Godzilla fighting the Herculoids.
Oh, I've seen that one. That is really cool. Or Frankenstein Jr. We've talked about him a few times before, sort of like the Americanized Gigantor, if you will, but a little bit more kid-friendly, who felt like a lot of giant monsters too might have been neat. Not that everything needs a crossover, and I get that that was 10 years prior to this series, so a lot of the kids who were watching this when they were kids might not have had much of a conception of who not Gigantor, Frankenstein Jr. was, or Moby Dick, if you're to do that type of crossover. Just was interesting that Marvel did it one way and Hanna-Barbera did it another way.
Right. I'm not sure they were somehow limited by Toho with what they can or cannot do. It seemed like they had a lot of creative freedom given how unique this version of Godzilla is compared to everyone else, every other incarnation. So maybe they could have been able to do a crossover, and then again, I don't think they have ever crossed over any of their action-based franchises.
Oh, they did quite a bit, actually. Later on with, like, Space Ghost and the Herculoids.
Oh, wow.
Would cross over. I believe there's a whole Space Ghost special where he does meet even, like, Moby Dick and others throughout time. But I definitely like Space Ghost, Herculoids, would meet a few times. I want to say maybe the Galaxy Trio in that mix, too. I'll have to check into that. But they did do it to some extent later on. So, okay. But not that they needed to. This can stand its own series. One thing I did think was kind of cool about this series, too, again, looking at positives, is they had nice homages to the Toho monsters while also creating some interesting monsters on their own. Like we had talked about, the Firebird is kind of like a Rodan homage, but then you have like the very unique monster in the Colossus of Atlantis, where it's sort of like an upside-down pyramid robot with a head.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Which was nothing against the monsters.
Let's see. I do remember the the weird crab Cyclops monster does look pretty unique as well. Other times they do just have like generic lizard or dragon-like monsters, or they just take a monster that's already existed, an animal that exists in real life, like an octopus or a manta or a flat manta ray, and just made a bigger version, or just straight up dinosaurs, like in the what was it called, the Time Dragons. where he
Yes.
fights, scares off a Diplodocus, oddly enough, a meat-eating Diplodocus, or a carnivorous Diplodocus, and facing off against a dinosaur. Which, by the way, it was kind of surreal to see Godzilla interacting with a real dinosaur, a slightly more realistic-looking dinosaur.
Right, which is just as big as him for some unexplained reason. But,
Right,
you know.
because who cares? Monsters.
Yeah.
Dinosaurs, monsters, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Let's see. I remember he faced off against the Yeti. I do remember the series finale, which it's not real. I guess it's technically a series finale. What was it? The Deadly Asteroid, where he, surprisingly enough, for the last episode of the series, he doesn't go up against a monster. Rather, he goes up against a giant asteroid that is being summoned by ice-based aliens. So he kind of fights them, their ship, and the asteroid. So it's kind of like the closest you'll get to Godzilla versus Gorath until we eventually got that in Final Wars.
Right.
Yeah, so that was an interesting spin on things. Let's see. And I mentioned before that a lot of the animations spend primarily on the action and Godzuki's shenanigans. I will say that a positive and a detriment to the series that I've noticed is that this series focuses the majority of its time on action and external conflict. They never have any breathing room to actually develop any of these characters. Like we mentioned, we know nothing about them. On top of that, they don't seem to have any personality whatsoever beyond like some sliver of one-dimensionalness to each of these characters. It's like Pete, he's young, he's innocent, and he is naive, I guess. Brock, he is young, but also serious. Captain Majors, he is mostly serious. Quinn, she is smart. Like, I can barely come up with anything to describe any of these characters because as soon as the episode gets started, we get some slapstick from Godzuki, and then the action of the external conflict immediately happens. And so through the rest of the episode, it's just the 5 characters and Godzilla trying to figure out how to solve this problem. And then by the end of the episode, everyone relaxes. But there's no real character there's no fleshing out of the character because we go back to Godzuki's slapstick and everyone going Godzuki. And then Godzuki just does like some sort of Scooby-Doo-esque and then the episode ends. So I like that there's a lot of action, and I'm surprised they were able to fill up these 22-minute like a roughly half-hour time block with a 22-minute runtime. With nothing but action, but at the same time, we know nothing about these characters. Even with something like Scooby-Doo, there is still a lot of personality that comes out of each of the characters, from Fred, Daphne, Velma, Shaggy, beyond just, Scooby-Doo himself.
Right. Well, I guess it's kind of an upside too, though, is we do get more personality from Godzilla than we do in other shows.
That is true.
Where there's like a monster base. So in that respect, I can look at it that way because, like you said, you do kind of get Godzilla laughing and he interacts with Godzuki to some extent and the other people. So I do kind of like that with their limited time, they focused more so on Godzilla instead of just having him be like show up and have no personality to him at all.
Right.
Makes it a little bit more endearing.
That is true. And I do like I find it a bit cute with the relationship between Godzilla and his nephew, where oftentimes Godzuki is a complete coward, even though he can oddly enough, he can actually solve most of these problems because he himself is a giant monster. However, he's much too cowardly to actually contribute to anything, but once Godzilla shows up, then all of a sudden he becomes a lot more confident because his uncle is there to help him out, and he tries to get involved, much to the detriment of Godzilla. So he's constantly trying to push Godzuki out of the way and try to keep him out of danger.
Right. And I think another positive to take from this series is this series would kind of lay a framework for the animated 98 series to follow. With the team of scientists and their boat, and they would call Godzilla when a monster showed up. To some extent, even the robot in that series would shadow Godzuki a little bit, where he's kind of like a goofy sidekick, but they would do it in a much better way with more defined characters. But I think clearly this influenced that in terms of the setup for the show. Do you agree or disagree?
Yeah. You're not the first person who has made that comparison, and in fact, there is actually a really cool fan art out there depicting the two versions of animated Godzilla and their human casts facing off against one another, and you can definitely see
Yes.
the parallels between those two shows there. And it would make sense to have both characters, to have this setup of having a boat with a bunch of characters that have Godzilla around, because you're able to make Godzilla into a relatable protagonist, and it gives them an excuse to travel the world, see many neat locales for each episode, and to have a variety of different monsters based off of real life animals, which both shows do. Whether it's like a lack of creativity or it's part of the plot, either way it works, I think. And yeah, it is interesting how what this show ended up contributing. And also another thing it contributed was, I believe, the confusion between Minya/Manila and Godzuki, because I'm pretty sure there are a good portion of people who would think that Godzuki and Manila are the same character. And so I've often had, even at least from my own personal experiences, I've had my family, they would refer to Minya or Manila as Godzuki, and I would say, no, mom or dad, Godzuki, that's another thing. He only existed in the cartoon show. This is another character who is Godzilla's actual son, even though he's also not related, just like Godzuki, technically.
Right. No, I definitely agree with that, because for outside of the Godzilla fan base, you'll see that quite a bit, where they refer to the son of Godzilla as Godzuki, which is kind of interesting it's the Godzuki that has permeated the larger culture, if you will, at least in the United States, as the son of Godzilla. I don't know if it's the same in Japan where you're at, or if this is a much less well-known series over there.
Oh yeah, they have at least when it comes to the people that I've talked to here in Gifu, they have no clue of the existence of Hanna-Barbera Godzilla.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, they don't even have any knowledge of the 2014 Godzilla. They, again, most of the people in Japan, at least from my experiences, they have no clue that Godzilla is as popular internationally as it is in Japan. Because for Japanese people, I've said this many times again, but I never get tired of repeating this, that they generally do not care for Godzilla up until recently with Shin Godzilla, and only then it's because of Anno and all the rewards that, his reputation and all the rewards and accolations that Shin Godzilla eventually got in Japan. But before then, nobody could care less about Godzilla, and just think of him as, this obscure little thing from our past that we don't really care about. That's it. He's there, but we barely acknowledge him. Kind of like what I guess most Americans are with Mickey Mouse. If Disney wasn't so weren't so merchandise heavy with the mouse.
Right.
So they really have no clue how popular Godzilla is outside Japan. They just think that most Americans are into anime and nothing else. So anytime I share with my students that, hey, I'm a Godzilla fan, and so is a large portion of the world, and that, hey, Godzilla is arguably the most recognizable Japanese character in the world, they'll be like, whoa.
Right, because I think you said like Ultraman, for instance, is probably more popular than Godzilla in Japan.
Oh, totally, yeah. I mean, I would say it's like maybe Sentai and Kamen Rider are like tied neck and neck, followed by Ultraman, and then maybe somewhere lower down the line is Godzilla. Yeah, because I've had like even child students who have grown up, have had a full childhood with no Godzilla up until recently.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Is there anything else you want to say about this particular series? I know we got a little off track on it.
It's all right. Let's see. I would say that one of my favorite episodes was perhaps the Colossus of Atlantis, the one that you brought up many times because of the robot itself. I like that they were able to raise a lot of stakes here. Like Godzilla was out of commission. They lost the Calico. There's a sense of mystery as to what happened to the people of Atlantis. There's some really trippy use of time travel here. And there's the amazing twist that the Atlanteans are actually aliens, which explains why they have such advanced technology. And I guess my favorite episodes are the ones where they take like pre-established ideas, be it the Chimera, the Sirens, or Atlantis, and they're able to do their own spin on them. Another one I liked was the Ghost Ship, and that was the one where they come across a frozen submarine that has these World War I era German soldiers, and even though they came up as very stereotypical and stereotypically evil, you expect them to come off as like Nazis who plan to like take over the Calico and take control of Godzilla by threatening the Calico crew. No, these guys were kind of treated as relatively normal people who is like, hey, we understand you've been frozen for 60 years, and we can totally see why you would think of us as enemies, but we're not enemies. Let us help you. And the German soldiers are like, oh shit, these guys might be telling the truth.
Yeah, I agree. I do feel like there's certain episodes that certainly stick out from the rest of the series, but stick out in a good way, like that they're just better than the rest of the series because of small changes. So
also, rarely I forgot to mention, rarely do you get any supporting human characters unless they're villains, and I think those are also really highlighted episodes, because whenever you have a series that had human villains, then that would give more motivation than just, oh, here's a monster that just popped out of nowhere, which is what the majority of the series is. One that comes to mind is this one evil scientist that creates clones of the Calico crew, and he plans to take over the world with another giant octopus, or maybe it was a giant squid in that episode. So he was a cool guy who was like a mad scientist who was evil for the sake of being evil and has no moral compass and goes too far with science. Although what's kind of weird is that they never explain what happens to the clones of the Calico crew. So I'm thinking, aren't you going to deal with the ethics of having clones of yourselves hanging around right now? No, we're not gonna deal with those clones of okay, I guess.
They were sent to the Mirror universe in Star Trek. That's what I understood.
Yeah, makes the most sense.
Yeah.
Let's see. Anything else to bring up? Those were the episodes that stuck out the most to me. Other than that, I guess the last thing I would want to say is the music, which I believe is like something that I have no problems with. I think it's probably one of the strongest aspects. I love how big and heroic they make Godzilla's theme out to be. There's a lot of trumpets, a lot of brass instruments. Even when they have like Godzuki's silly theme, they would have the trombones like womp 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 womp. So I would say that's probably the strongest aspect there, and it also kind of feels a bit similar to other Hanna-Barbera action shows at the time, but I think it suits the tone of this series.
I agree. I think the music is definitely a high point for the series. And the theme song is still memorable today. I mean, most Godzilla fans know that theme song.
Oh, yeah. A part of me does wish that they could take out the Godzuki bit a bit, because it kind of like, you get more pumped up, they're hyping up Godzilla, and then they kind of completely changes tones by throwing in, and Godzuki, do. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, I was also surprised to see that they were even went out of their way to recycle the animation from the intro as well for certain episodes.
Yes, the Godzuki tripping and rolling. Yes,
yeah,
popped up quite a few times.
Or Godzilla like rising out of the ocean and then you pan up to his head.
Yeah.
Let's see. Any other final thoughts or any thoughts that you have before going into final thoughts?
I do feel like this is a series, if for whatever reason a Godzilla fan hasn't seen it, it is worth checking out. Would you concur? Like, it's not just throw it away. It's worth checking out, for sure.
Yeah. It's definitely an interesting piece of media, and it is very entertaining in small doses. This is definitely not a show you would want to binge, which is what I did leading up to this review, because at that point, all the episodes start to blend together. So it's one of the things that it's great to revisit occasionally from time to time. And there's enough here to distance Godzilla, this version of Godzilla, from all other versions. Whether or not you like these changes, that's up to you. But for me, I dug it as well. And unfortunately for me, there are a lot of things that were very typical of 70s television animation that kind of keep it from being a great show. Even among the other TV shows produced by Hanna-Barbera, this one feels very lacking in the character department, and that's one of the things that really holds it back, alongside the lack of variety between the majority of the episodes. So I'm gonna have to give Hanna-Barbera Godzilla, let's see, I'm probably gonna have to give it a 2 out of 5, because I feel like the entire show is solid for the most part, but unfortunately, like, if you're not a monster fan, there's really nothing here that will latch onto you. But at the same time, what little entertainment is there, it really succeeds and is able to hold my attention for long. But I don't see it as a show with very strong. I think it's really like the writing that holds it back, where it's like, I would recommend watching part of the show, but I would never recommend like going out of your way to watch the entire show unless you were a diehard fan of Godzilla. So it's kind of like what the 2 is for. There's probably more bad than good, but there is still a limited audience for this piece of media.
Yeah, I was thinking the same ballpark. I will give it an extra half to give it 2.5, and it would be for my target demographic, is because it's a good show if you have young kids like I do and you want to introduce them to Godzilla, where you can kind of sit down and enjoy it together.
Sorry, can you repeat that, because you were breaking
Where it's not going to scare. If you have young kids like I do, to sit down with them and have it be like a nice bridge into Godzilla for them. So I would say 2.5 stars, but still not, much higher than that, because it won't scare young kids. Like, I remember as a kid coming across Godzilla in 1985 and it scared the crap out of me. Or Return of. So this won't do that. So I would say 2.5, but we're in that same 2 ballpark as you.
Yeah. For me, if I did halves, I would go that far, but I don't. I kind of keep things very simple and general. Like, if for me, a 3-star, like a 3 out of 5 is something that's like very solid. It's worth a look, in its entirety. With Godzilla, I feel like even if you saw a couple episodes, that's all you really need to get the gist out of it.
Okay, well, if we're going whole numbers, then I would round down to the 2. Fair
okay. Yeah. All right. But yeah, it is. If you are a Godzilla fan, I would recommend checking out Godzilla, the Hanna-Barbera series, and seeing for yourself, and see whether or not you do like this incarnation of Godzilla and his supporting cast. You know what? I really wish that was some sort of like a continuation or some adaptation of this version of Godzilla. Like, I know recently DC Comics and Hanna-Barbera had a huge collaboration where they were kind of doing reboots of a lot of their Hanna-Barbera shows, or doing major crossovers. It's a shame that Hanna-Barbera can never do anything with Godzilla outside of producing DVDs, solely because these characters, the main character, does not belong to them anymore.
Right. What you were just mentioning, just very quick side note, the Future Quest series, which crosses over a lot of the Hanna-Barbera characters, is really good. So for any fans who haven't checked that out, I can only recommend that. But yes, it would be neat to see kind of more of an update of this character. Comics would probably be a good venue to do that, where we could get a little more in depth into the crew of the Calico and what they're doing and how they met Godzilla and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I'm sure for copyright reasons they absolutely can't.
Right. It's unfortunate that Hanna-Barbera can't do one single collaboration with IDW with their Godzilla comics instead of their full partnership with DC. But let's see. I guess it's maybe because Hanna-Barbera is owned by Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers owns DC. So there you go.
Right.
Let's see. As for availability, the first season is available through 3 separate volumes. I'm not sure if these volumes are still widely available, but unfortunately, season 2 of the show has never been released officially. However, I was able to get a release of season 2, a bootleg of season 2, through an old website that I have mentioned several times in the past when I first started my YouTube channel. A website called Show a Video. I'm not sure if they're still around these days, but they made an excellent bootleg of season 2 and was able to reproduce like that style, the same style of the season 1 DVDs that Warner Brothers released. So it would like look really well next to your on your shelf. Let's see. Otherwise, you can just check it out online through the sites that you may or may not be familiar with when it comes to watching or streaming shows online. Let's see. So, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us for our second installment of our retrospective of Godzilla in animation. So, Matt, what will we be looking at next time?
The next time we are looking at Godzilla Land, correct?
Right, Godzilla, or if you are a person who is more familiar with the Japanese title, Gojirando, which is the series of educational VHS animated shorts that detail Godzilla's life back when he was a small child living on Godzilla with all of his monster buddies, learning about math and Japanese. So it's a piece of animation that came out during the smack dab in the middle of the Heisei era, and so it was only within the last couple of years it was uncovered and discovered by Westerners. And you can kind of, up until the release of Godzilla Planet of the Monsters, this was technically the only Godzilla anime in existence, and it's nothing like what Americans have always wanted out of a Godzilla anime, but we're going to check it out and see how well it works as both a piece of children's entertainment and children's educational entertainment. So tune in for that. I have been Andres Perez, aka Kaiju Noir.
And I've been Matthew Denyon.
And until next time, everybody, take care.